So at this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Christain Friis. Am I saying it right, Christian?
You nailed it.
Is it Friis?
Yeah, you got it. Nice job.
All right. I love it when I
First
get
time.
something right.
It's impressive.
So, yay. Christian has been the Canadian Wildlife Service Ontario Region shorebird biologist since 2009. So he is really good with shorebirds. I'm excited about that. He caught a break when he was welcomed as a volunteer to Long Point Bird Observatory's tree swallow project in the year 2000 with David Hussell. He was hired to work for Long Point Bird Observatory in 2003 as tip warden and took on a marsh bird technician role at Canadian Wildlife Service in 2006. He then moved to focus on shorebirds in 2009, where he now works to monitor and conserve their populations. And we're so glad you do that because we love shorebirds. So, Christian, I'm turning it over to you.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks so much, Angie. This is a real pleasure to be here. Was involved early on in my career with OFO as membership secretary. That had been before my daughter was born. So we're looking around 14, 15 years ago. And yeah, just a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this technology works. Let's see.
Looks
How's that
good.
looking?
Yep, you're good.
Are we still good here?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Um, so like I said, I'm really pleased to be here. This is a really exciting opportunity. I feel like I haven't been in the position long enough now that I should have probably gone around and had a little bit more of public engagement and things like that. So I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you folks today. I also want to keep it kind of interactive. So if you have questions, I won't answer them during the talk, but if you have questions, throw them in the chat so you don't forget them. And I'll try and get to them, and I can also reply to them after. I'll have my contact information and stuff. I would really like talking about shorebirds and that. So if you guys are keen, don't be shy. Um, Before I start, I want to just acknowledge the land from where I meet with you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I'm grateful to work and live on this land. And I'd ask that you take a moment and just think about where you come from and where you are today and what brought you on that journey and what your place is in that journey.
He also knows that Johnny may not be going anywhere.
Someone seems to have their mute button on.
Cal has no idea how the odds are weighted or what bets his private, desperate algorithms might find.
So today we're talking about shorebirds, and I'll highlight a few of the amazing examples of this diverse group of birds. We'll also talk about the population decline shorebirds as a group are experiencing and why these are ongoing, and I'll dig into some specific examples of species I've studied, and I'm focusing on some of the projects that I've done or worked on recently with Canadian Wildlife Service Ontario, but also touch on some of the work that we're working together to collaborate with nationally and internationally. Now, shorebirds are a diverse group and include sandpipers, plovers, oyster catchers, phalaropes, and there's approximately 220 recognized species of shorebirds around the world, and 84 of these occur in the Americas for all or part of their life cycle. And 29 shorebird species commonly occur in Ontario, with major concentrations of 14 of these. And most shorebirds are found near water, but several species prefer habitats far from shore. So they use a variety of habitats from intertidal mudflats, sandy beaches, rocky coastlines, to freshwater wetlands, grasslands, plow fields, and flooded agricultural lands. They mainly feed on mollusks, small crustaceans, marine worms, and insects. And this necessitates them to span a variety of sizes and bill shapes, leg lengths, and each species is uniquely adapted to access their preferred food in their specific habitat type. Now, of the 40 shorebird species that regularly breed in Canada, 22 regularly breed in Ontario, and 7 of these have significant concentrations of breeding populations. But unfortunately, a lot of these species are in decline. And according to the most recent State of Canada's Birds Report, these guys are experiencing what amounts to a serious, I mean, people throw around the word crisis a lot these days, but this is, to my mind, a crisis. And shorebirds are incredible. I mean, godwits are, this is an example here of some of the most amazing migration feats you can undertake on the planet. And bar-tailed godwits, the bird on the right-hand side there, they are recorded, as far as I know, as the longest nonstop flight of any bird at 12,000 kilometers in 8 days. Like, that's just straight flying. The bird on the right is Hudsonian godwit, as I'm sure a lot of you know. They breed in Alaska and the Hudson Bay region, and they migrate all the way to the southern tip of South America, more or less. And some of the major stopover areas that are important to them are highlighted with the dots that are on that map. And they accomplish this by how they're built. So they get these huge pectoral muscles. They have really long wings for fast sustained flight. And what's remarkable is they shrink their guts when they pack on fat to fuel their resources to get to fuel their migration. Here's another example, lesser yellowlegs, and the map on the bottom is produced by checklists that are submitted by birders like you folks. And what I really want you to take away from what you're seeing in this visualization, if it's coming through on your video, which I hope it is that these birds are almost entirely on the move, and their breeding season is extremely short. And so there's some key points that we need to think about here, but I wanted to step back and look at the tease out the State of the Canada's Birds Report. This is a figure from 2019, but the figure still stands today. When we split these short distance and long distance migrants subgroups out of the shorebirds as a whole, we really see that these long distance migration groups are facing some of the steepest declines within shorebirds together. And of course, this has led to a lot of these species being listed as at risk federally. And the species you see on the screen here are the ones that occur in Ontario. There are two additional species, mountain plover and long-billed curlew, that are also federally listed, but they don't occur in Ontario. Given the declines you've seen in some of these figures so far, you might not be surprised to hear that there's an additional, and this is really sad, but there's an additional 18 species, Arctic breeding shorebirds, that are being considered for assessment of the CSIWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, for at-risk designation. Shorebirds are long-distance migrants. They breed in the Arctic. Most of them breed in the Arctic and fly as far as the southern tip of South America. And they do this to access seasonal resources in different habitats, like insect emergence in the Arctic, where there's lots of food for a brief window when their chicks are hatching. There's also less nest predation, competition, and parasites than in more temperate regions. But because the Arctic becomes a cold and dark zone in the winter, at least in the boreal winter, they need to relocate to habitats that are a little bit more hospitable. So they undertake migration, and migration is energetically expensive. And many of these shorebirds rely on a limited number of key stopover sites where they refuel and make their next long flight during their migration. And in the Western Hemisphere, there are three main flyways. There's the Atlantic, the mid-continent, and the Pacific. But as you can see, shorebirds make use of a variety of routes. And during their migration, they need stopover sites that provide adequate food and resources and habitat where they can feed and rest. And without high quality sites, survival and breeding performance may be affected in the long run, which is, I think, why we're seeing a lot of these declines, continued declines and precipitous declines that I showed you in some earlier figures. And if they fail to build up enough fat, they may die on migration or be unable to breed and raise chicks. Shorebirds are threatened at stopover sites by coastal development that destroys habitat, overharvesting that depletes food resources, and human disturbance. But to understand population declines and contribute to recovery, we need to understand species' full annual cycles. So we know where the critical sites they rely on during migration are, so we can protect those sites. We also need to understand during what parts of their life histories they're vulnerable, so we can design effective conservation measures and put them into action. One step toward designing those conservation measures is to fill in the knowledge gaps that remain for a given part of the year. And that's what I'm going to get into a little bit later on in the talk tonight. In addition to habitat alteration and degradation, shorebirds are exposed to many threats during their annual cycle. They need time to digest and feed, or digest and rest. And this is a behavior known as roosting, as you all likely know. And disturbance to this kind of behavior causes shorebirds to fly around instead of gaining the fat that they need to fuel their migration. There's been an increase in predator populations like fox or raccoons, introduced species like pet dogs, and this has thrown the predator-prey balance out of whack. And back in the 1800s, shorebirds were hunted almost to the brink of extinction, which brought about the Migratory Birds Convention. But today, still outside of Canada, there's unregulated hunting, and which is still a threat to many species, particularly in the east. But today, the primary threat to survival of migratory shorebirds is the disappearance and degradation of habitat. Sometimes the habitat's there, but it has degraded to the point that it no longer is healthy and can support the wildlife as it did in an unspoiled state. Draining of wetlands, increased use of chemicals can degrade the habitat. Aquaculture can create habitat, but in many cases, it's not compatible with shorebird needs. Resource management can conflict with shorebird conservation. The location of energy production can affect sites favorable to shorebirds. And of course, garbage and pollution are probably the most best known examples, garbage and oil spills are the best known examples of pollution, but other things like runoff from agricultural input chemicals to the environment that affect the health of shorebirds. The biggest threat an oil spill presents to shorebirds is the timing. If one coincides when there's a large congregation, the population level effects could be disastrous. Excuse me. Finally, climate change is affecting shorebird habitat and populations. From vanishing coastlines to increased frequency and severity of storms, shorebirds face myriad challenges. In addition to sea level rise and extreme storms, climate change is making the world hotter and drier, and drying of wetlands and other habitat reduces the amount of food available for birds to eat. Hot and dry conditions can increase diseases, parasites, and exotic species. All of these reduce the amount of habitat suitable for shorebirds. Climate change is shifting when the timing of insect emergence happens, which can reduce how much shorebirds can feed their young. I've really painted a kind of a gloomy picture to start this talk off, and I hope I haven't scared some people off. But it's not all bad. People are taking some action, and like communities are banding together to clean up beaches. Key sites are being closed to access during specific times to allow shorebirds to feed and rest and breed. Governments are making policy changes that benefit shorebirds. Consumers can make informed choices that benefit conservation of not only shorebirds, but biodiversity in general. Taking steps like educating the public about why beaches are closed can have huge benefits to local buy-in and general understanding of the world around us. Partnering with communities to advance conservation has proven to be successful at sites across the Western Hemisphere. And of course, land protection is some of the best ways we can conserve important sites. We're developing plans to help people manage the land to be compatible with the organisms that use it. And we're monitoring wildlife and habitat to understand where we need to focus attention. And speaking of monitoring, I'm going to dive into some of the stuff that I've been working on in the past little bit. So let's zoom in here. We're going to first take a step into the subarctic region of the Hudson Bay lowlands. This is the region that supports the third largest wetland in the world. It's the homelands of the Mushkegowuk Cree. And Moosonee is one of the only accessible sites, or one of the only accessible towns year-round, which you can get to by train. There are two migratory bird sanctuaries that you can see highlighted in green, along with the river provincial park. So I'm just going to jump into the work we were operating in James Bay, which is known to host hemispherically important number of shorebirds. And the broader Hudson Bay lowlands region supports breeding habitat for significant concentrations of waterfowl, shorebirds, waterbirds, and landbirds. But before I jump into that project, I want to travel back in time and understand how we got to where we are today and learn about some of the earliest Western science from the lowlands. And some of the earliest bird collections in North America were sent to England by Hudson Bay Hudson Bay Company officers. The first names on record are Alex Light and James Isham. And starting in 1939, the Royal Ontario Museum led 5 expeditions and Hope, in short, published their first shorebird observations in 1948. And in 1947, Thomas Henry Manning, along with 3 colleagues working for the Geodetic Service of Canada, which is now Natural Resources Canada, where they were mapping James Bay and Hudson Bay, during their downtime made notes and collected birds. In 1949, he returned with the Geographical Bureau and his colleagues, and during downtime again, if you can imagine, this dude is making maps of a region that's never been explored in pretty harsh conditions, and he's still taking notes and collecting birds. He's submitted over 750 bird specimens to the National Museum of Canada, which is now the Canadian Museum of Nature, all the way from Moose Factory to the Nelson River. Quite a large expanse of geography. Now, in 1948, the Dominion Wildlife Service, which is now what CWS is, partnered with the RCMP to supervise visiting hunting parties to James Bay, mainly to ensure bag limits were followed. And at the time, blue geese were the primary target, and they also conducted wildlife surveys for CWS as part of the patrols. Upon confederation with Canada in 1949, Dr. Leslie Tuck was appointed the province's first Dominion Wildlife Officer, an association with the CWS that lasted 27 years until his retirement in 1976 as a research scientist. And Dr. Tuck studied snipe and spent a lot of time up in the southern James Bay region. Around the same time that Dr. Tuck was wrapping up his work, Dr. Guy Morrison, a keen British shorebird biologist, had recently joined CWS and wanted to start up a shorebird program, and had heard the stories of shorebirds on the James Bay coast and understood the very flat gradients, large expanse of mudflats. And so he conducted an aerial survey for a site to set up a base camp. And so he hired a twin otter and flew the coastline. And as he flew north, he started seeing these depositional wide marshes, these high energy coastlines, large promontories like Long Ridge Point that jut out into the bay, these jigsaw marshes that are associated with some of the large estuaries that flow out into the bay, these crescent-shaped ridges that are part of the northern James Bay region. And as he got to Hudson Bay, he saw all the large beach ridges. And of course, did see a large number of birds on the way. And if you can guess on a count, I'd love to see what you folks come up with on this. Throw it into the chat. I can tell you what the count is at the end. But birds weren't the only thing they found. And polar bears are for sure intimidating. It's not something I ever really want to meet face to face. And they had a few close calls, but no one got injured or anything. This is just a trike that got beat up by a polar bear over the winter. So they eventually landed on North Point, which is about 27 kilometers northeast of Moosonee, which had an existing goose hunt camp. So it made for pretty comfortable accommodations. There was an airstrip they flew in, supplies and crews. There are also fewer white bears there, which is a pretty big bonus. So I mentioned how the coast is pretty flat, a low gradient, kilometers of mud flats at low tide. So they used mist netting as their principal trapping technique, and they also did some cannon netting when the weather was good. And they started banding operations in 1975. And they had, at the time, they ran between 70 and 150 mist nets across 2 kilometers of coastline. And their lines of nets were about 17 nets long each. And they ran these nets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as the weather was good. And they used trikes to check the nets to make sure birds weren't being injured and remove them. And a lot of the efforts of this research provided us with some of the first understanding of where birds go to on their migration and where they spend their non-breeding period. As you can see, the accommodations are pretty comfortable for the banding camp. Birds were returned to the camp where they are processed. You can see the sort of burlap covered boxes or holding pens for species. And when the birds were finished processing, they were returned to the coastal marshes near where they were trapped. Now here's Dr. Morrison himself taking some of the measurements, and they took some of the standardized morphology that is taken today for in banding operations like wing, bill, weight. They also examined for molt, and on top of it, they did some color dyeing, which I'll show you in a little bit, and also color banding. This is the days before leg flags and tags and all that kind of stuff. And here's just a view of what the hunt camp looked like back in the late 70s. It's pretty swanky. But unfortunately, it eventually folded. But now the site is home to a Moose Cree family hunt camp. Here's to give you an idea of what the accommodations looked like inside. You do need a bug net. During that period of time when they were working up out of North Point, they also set up a satellite camp at Long Ridge Point, and it had a pretty spectacular view. But this site is now also home to a Moose Cree First Nation hunt camp. In addition to bird tracking and tagging and whatnot, they also studied the invertebrate population to understand the food resource availability for birds along James Bay. So I mentioned the color dyeing. So here's an example of a red knot that's been color dyed. The primary species they focused on were semi-palmated sandpipers, and they color dyed over 37,000 individuals and had about a 6% return rate, which is remarkable if you compare it to banding operations, which get about a 0.5% return rate. And like I mentioned, this is well before the days of satellite tags or VHF tags that we are now using. And these color-dyed birds gave us some pretty extensive information on dispersal and migration. The research gave us insights into weight gains and molt patterns of the birds using and moving through James Bay. And we also came to understand that it was a significant concentration zone for red knot, as well as Hudsonian godwit. And it's hard to kind of believe that for the longest time, Hudsonian godwit was considered to be extinct because so few birds were seen in the south. But this is a shot of a flock of about 10,000 birds around Chickney Point, which is north of the Albany River. And this was found during one of the aerial surveys of Dr. Morrison's research program. And the map on the left here is thanks to our colleagues in CWS Northern Region and the Center for Conservation Biology at William Mary in Virginia. It shows the direct flight that these birds take from the staging area in James Bay down to South America. All right, now let's get back to the future and check out some of the stuff we did for the James Bay Shorebird Project, or what eventually became the James Bay Shorebird Project, because this handsome man here, Mark Peck, led a pilot program from the ROM funded by the MNR to study, count and study species at risk along the James Bay coast, specifically red knots, short-eared owl, and yellow rail. CWS was invited when the project got funding for an additional year in 2010, and it eventually grew to this large project that involved numerous personnel, multiple sites, graduate students that you can see too pictured here. Significant partnerships were made, lots of funding, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without these strong partnerships and consistent funding. So I want to recognize those folks here. And we started with some basic goals, really. We wanted to know how many and which shorebirds use the coast. We wanted to include the count data and population assessments. We wanted to understand where birds move locally and throughout the flyway, and also identify important sites and habitat features for shorebirds using James Bay. And so this map here, the pink dots, if you can see the pink coloration, are the locations where we spent our time between 2009 and 2019. Two of the sites were accessed more by foot. We could actually get to them from some of our more swankier base camps. Anyhow, all of our sites were located at Moose Cree hunt camps. We had pretty comfortable accommodations. We conducted shorebird surveys, so actual counts, ground counts. We covered about 5 kilometers of coast every day, upwards of 20 kilometers of coast, depending on how ambitious we were feeling. A schedule was really driven by the tide cycle. So at low tide, it's quite difficult. As you can see, there's a large expanse of habitat here, but at high, as the tide flows in, it really concentrates birds and makes it a lot easier to count the individuals and species. It also helps if we're looking for uniquely leg flagged individual shorebirds, which is a technology that came into use quite some time ago, during the time the guy was up north. And of course, there were some pretty special days. Like this is about 20,000 white rum sandpipers here, almost in the shot. I mean, you can see some of them are cut off, but remarkable numbers of shorebirds up there. It's crazy. We also looked at feeding, and if you remember, I talked about guys looking at invertebrates, and so I'm going to get back to that, but I just wanted to highlight those two things. We conducted it the same way. We wanted to replicate the methods that they used back in the 70s. It's not advancing. Here we go. So these are some of the more common species that we focused a lot of our efforts on, and I'm just going to jump quickly into a couple of figures. Here just to give you a flavor of what the data looks like over time. And really, I show these for a couple of reasons, just to understand the abundance at a couple of the sites. So we're looking at Pasquamish Point on the left and Long Ridge Point on the right. But I also want you to understand the trend through the season. So there's changes over time and consistency over time, which is really interesting. And we didn't only count shorebirds, we counted everything. So we can do this kind of stuff with waterfowl and passerines. And our counts also included specific transects that allowed us to look a little bit finer at ages, for example. So here we've got Hudsonian godwits and red knots at Little Pasquamish Point. From left to right, we're looking at juveniles. In the middle is adults, and on the far right are individuals combined. And what's really interesting is you can see on all individuals combined the two pulses of adults and juveniles moving through the region. We could also figure out adult to juvenile ratios, and this is an example from Long Ridge Point. And I highlight this because it can give us a proxy to understand how successful breeding was in a specific year. You can see some years had much higher numbers of juvenile to adult ratios than others, which might indicate that there was a good year or not. We also did trapping and tagging, and we definitely did not have the setup that Guy had. You can see here is a common setup at Long Ridge that we employed, and we often had no more than 20 nets or so. We didn't have trikes or ATVs. It was all on foot. The banding station was a little bit more rustic, still a beautiful view. And we took all the same measurements that Guy did. We took blood samples as well for understanding fat accumulation and food inputs, and also sexing and aging. We studied molt, and we used radio tracking, which provided some pretty exciting stuff, which I'll jump into in a little bit. But before I do, I just wanted to give a perspective of banding versus and the amount of effort that's required compared to our radio tracking, and why we decided to employ some technology like VHF radio tracking. Some of the typical tracking technologies, they all have their limitations, and each can answer a specific question. And for the James Bay Shorebird project, radio telemetry provided a good balance of value of data for cost of answer to answer the questions. So in 2014, we joined in with what was in the emerging MODIS program that's coordinated by Birds Canada. And in addition to being a shared infrastructure, the project is heavily collaborative. So this is to give you an idea. All these yellow dots are what the network looked like in 2014 when we joined. You can see we had a few towers up in southern James Bay. But this has now exploded into this worldwide coverage, and you can just understand the difference between the number of detections you would get from 2014 versus now. And what's neat about this is the system is really beautiful. The receivers are autonomous. You can see the tower there on the right hand side. The tags are all unique. They have a unique signal. They're small. They can go on virtually any bird species. I just wanted to give you an idea of what the coverage of southwestern James Bay looked like. So if you can make out the faint yellow sort of ellipses, that you can see that we more or less had a net of the entire southern portion of James Bay with our tower array. Now this is the computer that collects and records all the tag detections. It's really cheap, and the best part is, like, if it gets flooded or something, or there's a component that blows out on you, you can just plug and play with a new piece. You don't have to get a whole new system. It's just boom, you got a new You get a new wire, you get a new you get a whole new computer. Yeah, it's a pretty sweet setup. So we use the tag data to answer questions like how long birds stayed, where they stayed within the southern James Bay region, and then where they went when they left. And this is just an example of how many birds we tagged in 2019, and it's pretty typical for an annual thing. And unfortunately, I didn't pull out the total number, but it's in the hundreds of tags that we deployed between 2014 and 2019. Now, if we jump into what the tag detections look like, it's a bit of a mess, but I don't want you to get too overwhelmed. I'm pulling out two white rump sandpiper examples here, and you can see where the 1st of September is being pointed out on the graph there. The red dots across the top are the bird staying at one location being detected by one tower, and then as it migrates, it gets picked up by each of the towers south. So on the vertical axis, the y-axis, is a latitude, and on the bottom axis is date. So now just picking into some individual birds, and this one is a hatchier bird. So I'm highlighting this because it's interesting to see what birds are doing based on their age. So young birds are showing something a little bit different than what adults show. Now, if the top figure is our count data from our daily shorebird surveys, and the bottom figure is the tag detection data. On the right hand on the vertical axis are all the tower locations, and on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is date. And what I want you to notice is that this bird got tagged kind of early August. It eventually moved its way south, more or less to Hannah Bay Migratory Bird Sanctuary, where it stayed until it departed. Here we have an adult semi-palmated sandpiper. Same setup as the last figure with counts on the top, tag detections on the bottom. But this bird, interestingly, stayed at one site for the entire period before migrating south. And it stayed for quite a while. You can see August 4th to August 25th or 26th by the time it left. This is a white rump sandpiper. I just wanted to mix up the species. You can see that it did the exact same thing as an adult. It stuck around this one area at Long Ridge Point and then migrated. You can see it pinging its way down through the towers as it migrated out of the James Bay region. And then finally, a red knot, just because this is one of the species that's near and dear to my heart. This is an adult red knot that stayed somewhere between Long Ridge and Little Pasquamish before departing around the 12th of August. And what I think is really interesting about this is that our shorebird counts really nicely align with the departure of this individual, which indicates to me that there was a mass exodus of birds at that point of adults. And so from these detections, we can begin to understand how long birds are using James Bay. You could probably ask why the semi-palmated sandpiper and white rump sandpiper have longer windows on this box plot, and that's because birds were tagged at our sites, whereas the red knots were tagged outside of our sites in James Bay. So we have a much tighter window. So the semis and white rumps have a minimum length of stay, whereas red knots, that's like more or less their true length of stay based off of the tagging data. And when we look at birds where they go when they leave, there's a lot happening on this figure, so I'll let it run for a little bit. But you can see on the top right, as dates tick by, it says starts, showing, and finishes. So it's about a month-long period of birds flying out of James Bay and into the network. And this is from 2014. So I showed you guys the figure of the number of towers. So without a tower, the tag can't get detected, obviously. So what's really neat is just how the birds are flying out of James Bay, and there's like these pulses of individuals. I'll let it run one more time just so you guys, now that you might understand what's happening a bit better. Each of the colors is a different species as well. But really at the beginning of September, you start to see a lot of these birds taking off and like full on leaving the coast. All right, I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the aerial work we did. So from 2016 to 2019, we conducted aerial surveys. We followed the same route that Dr. Morrison did. They had sectors that split up the coastline so you could identify where you were counting birds. When we conducted them in 2016 to 2019 by helicopter, it was about a 2-day period. And we had 2 surveyors, so a person in the front and the person in the back, so double observer approach. Yes, and we follow the same setup as guided in the 70s. But I want you to note really the consistency in the areas of the concentration, and the areas of the concentration are the larger circles. So the counts increase as you go down or increase in size. And also the annual variation. So it's not like there's always large numbers of birds being counted during these aerial surveys. Okay, now I'm going to jump into some of the graduate works. As a CWS biologist, we focus primarily on monitoring birds and counting them. With graduate students, we were able to bring in folks who could answer some more specific questions. And Ali Anderson, who's now Dr. Anderson, she successfully defended her PhD after working with us in 2019. She was really interested in the flexibility of shorebird migratory strategies in a changing environment. And in addition to using the tag data for and morphology, she was really interested in the diet and the flexibility of shorebird diet breadth during stopover. She focused on diet in invertebrate community, and she used the data from the 70s that Guy collected as well to look at any changes in historic diet use or diet considerations. And what she found is really neat. So a lot of these species have more or less diverse diets. Some of them, like at least sandpiper, seem to have quite a large number of individuals that they'll choose from, whereas semis seem to be a bit more choosy in what they want to eat. She also found that diet hasn't changed over the last 40 years, which is really cool. So no real change in the food resource availability in James Bay, which is a good news story. She also looked at the morphology. So when we were capturing birds, we were taking measurements of their wings and whatnot. And she found that it looked like birds are actually shrinking their wings. And this is possibly due to increased raptor populations. So raptors their populations have rebounded since the 70s. And this could be something of an evolutionary change to allow for shorter rounded wings, which allow for maneuverability as compared to longer pointed wings, which are more for sustained long flights. The results from our work have allowed us to understand how important James Bay is for birds to gain fat and fuel their migration. And if we relate this to the distance birds migrate, some interesting patterns emerge. So birds like knots that are long distance migrants rely on James Bay to make it to the non-breeding grounds. Also, where they winter affected migration strategy. Birds that wintered further south, like white-rumped sandpiper and pectoral sandpiper in the purple circle, stayed longer and put on more fat in James Bay than medium distance migrants like semi-palmated sandpipers and lesser yellowlegs in green, and especially than the shorter distance migrants like semi-plovers and least sandpipers in pink. All right, so that's Dr. Anderson's stuff, really cool stuff. I only touched on a few of the things, but some of the highlights from her work. Next, I want to just introduce you to Amy McDonald. Amy was really interested in the passage population of red knots using James Bay. She's now out in Vancouver, working for Birds Canada as a shorebird ecologist and MODIS coordinator. As we know, red knots are migrant champions as well, and they also rely on a few sites. And crab eggs, the figure on the right, top right, is a figure of crab egg harvest, or crab harvest, I should say, horseshoe crab harvest. And so red knots rely on horseshoe crab eggs on northbound migration in Delaware Bay to double their weight. They are literally become butterballs before they fly north. And you can see how horseshoe crab harvest increased during that period in the 90s. I highlight the increase in horseshoe crab harvest because we can correlate that with the decrease that we see in the most southern migratory population of roofer red knot, which spend their non-breeding period in Tierra del Fuego. If you can make out the colors, and I apologize for folks who have issues with color, they're red and green, so it was my bad on that one, but I highlight those because we can see that the change in counts at the Patagonia sites, the decrease in counts there can be accounted for by the increase in counts at Tierra del Fuego. Patagonia used to be a much more important non-breeding site than it is now. And of course, this decline in population is substantial, like substantial. I can't highlight that anymore. So Amy looked at counts from our work in James Bay, the shorebird counts that we conducted there, and then she related them to the flag resites. We had a really intensive flag resiting effort. So you can see the orange TY flag on this red knot here as an example. And she combined these two sets of data to come up with passage population estimates. So when birds are moving through an area, we don't necessarily know how many are, there's always birds coming in and there's always birds coming out. And we don't really know exactly how many are using the area over the entire migration period. So this is what Amy was focused on. And she came up with some pretty remarkable stuff, like 20% of the flyaway population uses this small area, that small southwestern portion of James Bay, a significant portion of the population. And this is just from 2017. So our resite data also told us that red knots spend about 12 days in James Bay, which is a good amount of time. They got to fuel up before they head south. We also understand the proportion of adults and juveniles that use the area, so it's heavily adult use in this part of the world. When birds stop in an area, there are waves of birds arriving and waves of birds leaving, like I said. So if we want to understand the total number of birds using, we use some complicated math, and I'm way above my head. I'm not a modeler like Amy is, very talented. But she crunched the numbers, and as you saw, 20% of the roofer red knot population use that small area of James Bay. She's now also working on red knot survival estimation using some of these metrics that I highlight here. So stay tuned for some of that information. It will be pretty key. So let's put this all together and understand how the project contributed to science and conservation. It contributed to the delineation of critical habitat in the federal red knot recovery strategy. We worked with Moose Cree First Nation to redraw the important bird area boundaries, which are now key biodiversity areas. The boundary remains. We worked with Moose Cree First Nation to nominate that same region, the same important bird area region, as a Western Hemisphere shorebird site of hemispheric importance. And that's currently in waiting. And I can't thank all the folks enough who helped volunteer with this. There are so many of them and so many agency participants as well. It's just like outstanding number of people. Okay, so I spent a lot of time, and I'm probably cutting it a little bit closer, but I spent a lot of time on our work in James Bay, but I want to just touch on a few of the projects that we've been working on in addition to that. That's took up a lot of my wind here today, but it produced a lot of really good science. And if you're interested, I can share with you some of the papers that were put out and a lot of the interesting results that also came in that I didn't touch on here. All right, so basically the furthest north we can go in the province, we're going almost as far south as you can in the province. And I want to shout out to Dave Martin, who may or may not be on the call. I'm sorry, I didn't look at all the participant names, but Dave turned me on to this area and as a region of importance for black-bellied plover and something worth studying. So I got on that. So I just want to shout out Dave Martin, thanks. So as you've seen, figuring out passage population of shorebirds as they migrate through inland areas is challenging. And little is known about the significance of inland habitats of shorebirds in Eastern North America, specifically these agricultural landscapes. And if you have spent any time in Southwestern Ontario, down in that zone highlighted in the map, you'll know that there's a fair amount of ag land there. This area plays host to a numerous spring migration shorebirds, and many support significant proportions of the total population for some species, which I'll show you in a sec. So we came up with this study to count birds with a focus on black-bellied plover. In those, if you can make them out, they're kind of yellowish zones on the map. Those were the main study areas where we found the larger concentrations, which covered about a 1,200 square kilometer area. And we surveyed these in the spring, so between end of April and early June in 2014 and 2016. And we also conducted a single day blitz where we covered all areas all at the same time to get a full region count. We also identified the habitat the shorebirds used in these areas. And it came up with some pretty interesting results. Like we're at you know, 11,000, over 11,000 individual black-bellied plovers in a day in that region. That is in the Western Hemisphere shorebird site of network site of regional importance. So a significant concentration. You can all see the densities of these individual species is pretty fantastic. And this is just to give you a flavor of the concentrations of birds. So on the left-hand side are dunlin, turnstones, and short-billed dowitcher, and on the right are black-bellied plover. You can really see how that Highway 3 corridor and the area down around Peely, specifically Hillman Marsh, is important, and then the southern Lake St. Clair zone is pretty key. But further studies needed to determine habitat features that are important to migrant shorebirds, and I'm working on that now with my friend and colleague Ross Wood. We're trying to write up these results. We presented a poster back when we first started this work, and I'm finally getting my act together to publish the results of this work. We want to understand the annual variation areas of concentration. This will aid our conservation of these species in this heavily human-influenced landscape. Now, sticking with agricultural landscapes, we initiated a Canadian range-wide study of upland sandpipers a couple of years back with a number of collaborators across CWS within Environment Climate Change Canada's Science and Technology branch. We had University of Saskatchewan and Lethbridge involved and brought in students. And we wanted to understand some of the things that were happening that we were seeing in upland sandpiper population estimates and trends. Upland sandpiper is a long-distance migratory shorebird. It inhabits grasslands on both the breeding and non-breeding grounds. It breeds in Canada from New Brunswick west to BC and north up into Yukon. And as you may recall from that figure I briefly showed at the very beginning, both shorebirds and grassland birds are experiencing dramatic population declines. Upland sandpiper is also a priority species for the Mid-Continent Shorebird Conservation Initiative, and it's well monitored by BBS because of its breeding range within the country. So what we're seeing from those trends from BBS is that since 2009, there's a stable trend range-wide, but steep declines in the eastern and isolated western Canadian breeding populations. So kind of a real pickle. And here's a map to show you, like, visualize what I'm talking about when I'm saying decline. So when you take this across a whole, it will give you a stable population, but there's at the edges of it, something is going on here. So little is known about geographic variation in the species, but there's evidence of general decline in body size from west to east across the breeding range. We know nothing about genetic structure of this population, like if there's any difference between the central, western, eastern. So we wondered if assigning population subunits, or what Kasiewicz calls designatable units, would benefit the conservation of the species. So could we direct specific actions towards specific subunits? Another concern related to the threats that these species, the upland sandpipers face because of their habitat choices. They're likely exposed to pesticides, including insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. So these all represent a pretty big threat. So if we want to determine the population exists, we also wanted to quantify migratory connectivity, population genetic structure, contaminant exposure across the Canadian breeding range using tags, genetics, isotopes, trace elements, and contaminants. We wanted to evaluate linkages between spatial variability and threats related to agrochemicals and spatial variation in population trends. And population subunits. So we had set out and just wrapped up our last field season this summer across all the 5 regions from New Brunswick to the Yukon. We had crews out trapping birds, upland sandpipers. We used mist nets on the nest. We tagged birds with satellite tags. We took blood for genetics, feathers for isotopes, and we also sampled fecal matter for contaminants and plastic loads. And looking at contaminants specifically, the use of chemicals is variable across Canada. So in the Pacific and Atlantic regions, for example, there's a long-term higher use of insecticides linked to fruit and vegetable production, whereas the use of these pesticides historically have been lower in prairie Canada, but it is increasing. So the sampling that we've conducted will clarify how changing patterns of chemical use might be affecting breeding populations of upland sandpipers across their range. We used, like I said, we used tags. We had 2 different kinds of tags. One's a platform transmitting terminal which is less, which has more fixes than a GPS tag. We can understand travel rate and total migration distance. They're easy calculated. We want to understand if there's any major stopover sites that are unknown for the species. And we can also develop these movement models. So our grad students that are working with us at the University of Saskatoon are now crunching those numbers. And so stay tuned for some pretty exciting results on this. Now, switching gears completely, I'm going to touch on a developing project led by another friend of mine and colleague, John Brett, looking at sewage lagoons. And you guys probably know about lagoons and that they host shorebirds. They're not a bad spot to go birding generally. And some of these lagoons have been converted to wetlands when wastewater treatment plants are put in place, places like Port Rowan Lagoon, for example. Other spots like Blenheim or Mitchell sewage lagoons have been converted to support wildlife. So we're now working with Dr. Anderson, actually, at Smithsonian Shorebird Conservation Collective to develop some of this outreach material to work with these wastewater treatment plant managers to understand whether there might be a way for us to conserve some of the habitat or manage it more towards wildlife use. So we're using their social science expertise to engage and host workshops to advance habitat management techniques that support wildlife, obviously within the bounds of their operational requirements. All right, finally, I want to quickly touch on the Ontario Shorebird Survey, which celebrated its 50th year of monitoring this year. I'm going to plug the survey pretty hard here. I really encourage you to join. It's super easy. I can help you out identifying a site. I can help you getting the data in or how you should enter it. Anyhow, join. It'd be great. It's a part of a larger network of sites of similar programs, including the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey and the US Coordinated International Shorebird Survey. CWS coordinates and manages the Canadian side of things, and Manomet coordinates the US side of things. Fieldwork is conducted by volunteers, and some of you are here tonight. I saw some names here. Hi, guys. Who visit sites every 2 weeks between late April and early June on northbound migration, and then late July through late October during, excuse me, southbound migration. And the surveys provide the foundational data for shorebird trends, status and trends assessment. So that early figure you saw with their declining trends, these data are feeding that in spades. And thankfully, we have some really smart modelers. Adam Smith and Paul Smith at our National Wildlife Research Center in Ottawa have developed these Bayesian models that use general additive modeling. This stuff is way over my head. I have no idea what it is, but they basically take really messy data with lots of observers and lots of uncertainty in it and help work it into a model that can tell us what it all means. And as you've seen, unfortunately, there are significant declines across the board. And we can also tease out some of these really interesting regional patterns. And we're looking here at, on the left-hand side is black-bellied plover, and on the right is sanderling. Some of these regional trends where birds are decreasing, which is more of the orangey yellow color, and increasing, which is the more of the blue. And the size of the counts, or the mean observed count, is the size of the circle is larger as you increase in size. So this raises questions like whether birds are changing where they're spending their winter. But for me, what's most alarming is that these declines are accelerating in the last 3 generations. So the last 3 generations of birds breeding, we're seeing significant declines across the board. And these declines are beyond Sarah listing thresholds in a lot of cases. And you guys may have heard of the 3 billion birds thing, and shorebirds aren't the only group experiencing these alarming population declines. Indeed, these have grabbed headlines worldwide. And it's a real bummer. But shorebirds face many threats, and we know their populations are not doing so well. And with all the challenges we face today, from climate change to biodiversity loss to new and emerging viruses, I want to end with some reasons for hope. I said a lot of stuff that's pretty like a real downer, but I see a lot of reasons for hope. Shorebirds are a key part of the land we share, and they have been here for millions of years, facing threats long before humans became so abundant. And if you look at the figure on the left, you'll see that despite alarming declines in some groups, significant gains have been made in others. And this is one reason that I have hope. It wasn't too long ago that Rachel Carson warned of a silent spring, and when DDT was banned, eagle, hawk, and falcon populations recovered. Waterfowl have recovered under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And these are all signs that if we take the right approach, Mother Nature can set a course correction. We just need to act. Thanks. That's it. I can't see anybody. Maybe I'll stop sharing. All right. I think I left a little bit of time for questions.
You did, and just as you were finishing, my phone started to ring, and I can't turn it off. Got it.
Classic.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
My pleasure. Sorry, I winged through a bunch of it at the end. I kind of got excited. Anyway.
It's a lot to take in. There are some questions in the chat.
Oh, okay, great.
So maybe
let's take a look.
Yeah.
Does the color dye decrease the bird's reproductive success? No, it does not. It does not affect them. In the same way that tags or bands do not affect them. They molt all new feathers, and once they molt their feathers, it's gone or it wears off. I see from the charts you were there in August. Would that be the best time of year to go on Moosonee? Well, if you're looking for shorebirds specifically, the peak migration really, and it's when we timed our aerial surveys, was around peak migration and a super tide, which is around the 10th of August or so, typically each year. It's in that zone, 8 to 12 of August. But that's when you're going to have the biggest number of birds and the highest diversity for sure. How does one obtain shorebird feces? That's a good question. So for the work up north, we the technicians we had working on that specifically, they were observing species. Like, you can get pretty close to them, and when they left their droppings, they would collect them. We also, when we trapped them, we had holding pens. We'd have individual holding pens. This was a much cleaner way to do it. But we'd have these little, more or less amount to little boxes that we lined with foil. And we put the bird in there before we did any of the processing to allow them to defecate, and we would then take that sample. But good question. That's the best way to do it is the last way I described. Let's see here. Black-bellied plover, doesn't being black on the tummy and speckled white and black on the back make it stand out to predators from above and below? Do they have any theories on how it came to evolve that color? Really interesting question. I think if you zoom up from a bird sitting on its nest and look at the back of a black-bellied plover in a tundra habitat, you can't find it. It's like it just disappears into the landscape. It's amazing. And evolution would have chosen a different path if it didn't work. I see Mark has a good question in here. I see someone has their hand up too. Maybe should I jump to the hands, or do you want me to finish with the chat? What do you recommend? I'm not sure how you guys roll with this.
We never really had to decide that before.
Right on. Well, I'm not gonna snub Mark because he's a good friend. Okay. My future plans, Mark, are that starting 2026, so the third Atlas of the Breeding Birds of Ontario's got its last field season next year, so 2025. A lot of our budget that had been allocated to work in James Bay was allocated to support the Atlas for good reason. This is a remarkable tool. It's an amazing accomplishment, really, if you think about the number of people who are involved in the project, the amount of hours people spend, the amount of data that's input, and then the conservation products that are produced from that, and the information we can glean from that. So anyway, 2026 is the earliest I plan to get a reinvigorated James Bay survey. It'll be a much lighter version from what you've seen. where we had like 3 or 4 camps operating with up to 14 individuals at a camp. That was a little bit over the top. But it is in the works. I'm working on a way of trying to get that to come to fruition for 2026 at the earliest. Question about the Ontario Shorebird Survey. How do you sign up? Send me an email. You can also sign up through the Nature Counts portal. So naturecounts.ca, there's a program for regional and international shorebird monitoring, PRISM. You can sign up through there. Honestly, the easiest way, I'll put my email in the chat as well, but the easiest way is just to send me an email. You can also find my contact information on the naturecounts.ca website associated with that PRISM portal. So I would strongly encourage people to consider it. It sounds like a lot of effort, 5 visits in the spring and 10 in the fall. But really, I am interested in getting as much data as possible. So if you can even get 3 visits in over the peak period, all of this data can get utilized for the status and trends assessment. Has there been any work done on trying to maintain flight paths, particularly where the birds would normally rest? I'm not sure what you mean, Aileen. Do you mean, maybe, can you expand on that?
Well, I was just thinking about more protecting normal resting areas for birds where they would normally go through, because one of the problems is the degradation of normal routes for these birds as we slowly you know, build homes on fields and you know, slowly encroach into what would have been normal historic like areas.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So through a lot of this tagging work and a lot of the early work with flags and stuff the guy worked on and his band recoveries that came through, we got a really good understanding of where these key sites are. And a lot of those have been identified by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And while that doesn't provide any legal mechanism for protection, it does provide a community that can build around keeping that area conserved. And some of these sites have been recognized as protected areas as well. So as you can imagine, having a migration that spans the entire Western Hemisphere, the number of countries that are involved in that sort of a situation can be challenging, and depending on government of the day for those particular countries, there may be an appetite to be more on the environmental side, and there may be an appetite to be less on the environmental side. So sometimes a lot of the things have to line up pretty nicely, but there are efforts towards conserving these key sites that I talked about. And not everywhere a shorebird stops is important necessarily. The key sites are like places like James Bay, where you have consistent resources available, large expanses of habitat, and they're used on an annual basis with significant numbers of individual birds. And that's how WISRN, which is the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, designates these sites. They use those kind of metrics to understand where to identify them, and then bring a community together to help work towards conserving it. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm just curious if there'd been any work on that. So
yeah, I mean, that's a key, like habitat loss and degradation. Humans are a real challenge on this earth. Jack, you've been very patient with your hand. I'm just going to ask you this one last question because it's quick. Estimating a large flock of numbers, we just guess. No, I'm kidding. No. We have, so there's some training programs you can go through. There's some software you can use, but really it's just experience. And starting with figuring out, you know, how many of a flock of 5 birds looks like, and then how many 10 look like, and then expanding that, and then counting in 5s or counting in 10s. When you're flying in a helicopter, I can attest, when you're flying in a helicopter at like 100 kilometers an hour and there's 2,000 red knots below you, that it can get a little bit tricky. And that's where spending a lot more time just honing that skill comes in. But really, it's just practice.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. Jack, very patient, my friend.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation, Christian. Lots of great information. This might be a hard question to answer on a generalized basis, but if you think of 3 regions that shorebirds need, their breeding grounds, their wintering grounds, and their migration grounds. From a conservation perspective, where do you feel that the most work is needed?
Good question, my friend. I'm going to lean on the migration side, and that's where I've spent a lot of time talking about. When you take away some of these links in the chain, it really has an influence on their ability to rest and gain the fat that they need and feed. So like I mentioned in some of the threats when I was talking earlier this evening about disturbance happening at these sites where birds are spending more time in the air than they are resting and feeding, that really hinders their ability to get to the breeding grounds and successfully breed. They might be able to get there, but they might not be in a good enough condition to continue and breed, and they may say, forget it, I'm out. And subsequently, as they're coming south. So I think the migration side is one of the key aspects from my opinion there, and that's where we're seeing a lot of significant threats associated with shorebird declines. And if you think about climate change, like I'd love to pull up a whole bunch of maps of tracks of red knots and stuff that we have on the go right now, like live tracks of birds. But they will fly out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hit a hurricane kind of in between the North American continent and the African continent, and turn around and fly back to the US. And then other times we'll just see the tags hit the eye of a hurricane and then they're gone. So, I mean, the increasing severity of storms and the increasing number of hurricanes and stuff is a significant challenge on top of it. So like, I just see that there's a lot, like migration is really, really risky. There's a reason that some species just spend all their time in one area because they're hedging their bets and they're making sure that they're not exposed to as many threats as migrants are. So I think the migration habitat is where we want to potentially focus a bit more energy on. That said, there's a lot to still be learned about the breeding grounds. There's a lot to be understood about productivity of shorebirds, because they mostly breed in the Arctic, which is this remote, inaccessible area. There's a lot to be understood there. And then conversely, in South America, where they spend a lot of time during the non-breeding season, there's still lots we can learn from those areas. And obviously, a lot of partnerships have been developed. The shorebird community is really tight. That way, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Group is a really great venue for people to get together from across the Western Hemisphere. They just had their, I forget which number of meeting it was, maybe 15th, but it was in Sackville, New Brunswick this past August. So shorebird biologists from across the Western Hemisphere gathered there to meet and talk about how to work towards conservation. So there's a real effort afoot with the shorebird group for sure. And not to say that there isn't with other bird groups, but yeah, just I want to go back to that reasons for hope slide I left off, because there is so much in the news today about loss of biodiversity and declining species populations and climate change and all this stuff, that I think we need to have like a bit more of a positive outlook on things and find the goodness that's out there.
Great, thank you.
Do something. Do something.
Any more questions for Christian? Or any suggestions of the things we can do? I guess just keep doing what we've been doing. Right? Send the letters, sign the petitions.
Yeah.
I like the
Manage.
idea. I like the idea of having protected areas where when they do land, they're not disturbed.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, so in New Jersey and Delaware Bay, they closed beaches during the northbound migration to allow shorebirds to rest and feed because it was the first Wizardin site of hemispheric importance identified in the network, and for good reason. And so they've now been able to close most of the beaches where birds are feeding and resting to allow them to do that, so they're not disturbed by humans who want to use the beach. And that couldn't have happened without education and outreach from the folks that work down in that region.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting a bit late, so I think we've asked questions, and I just want to say one more time, thank you, Christian, for your presentation, for sharing with us tonight. It's very sobering, but hopeful too at the same time. Yeah. And thank you all the people who signed in tonight and who participated and asked questions. Tell everybody about OFO. You can find the video on YouTube. Find some birds.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining tonight and for your interest in some of the work that we've been conducting. And like I'm honest when I say don't be shy. Send me an email. I'll hook you up with my phone number. We can have a conversation. And I'd be very grateful if we were to accumulate a couple more volunteers to help support the OSS. Really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And I would wish you a good night. Merry Christmas. I don't think we have any more meetings until January. And I believe the next one is actually a week later than usual because the first Wednesday of the month in January puts us into New Year's celebrations. Yeah, actually, that is New Year's Day. So will be the second Wednesday of the month in January. I think we're talking to people from Young Birders Camp that night. So that should be fun. Okay. So good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, all. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I have to turn off the recording. All right. Got it.